Hi, this is the first of what I hope to be several podcasts, videocasts that I'm putting on my blog. Most of the work that I do as a veterinary chaplain revolves around the grief process. That's not all I do, but the pet loss support group that I facilitate and the individual counseling that I do primarily focuses on grief and the mourning and the grief work that we need to do when we lose our pets. Because of that, I wanted to do this podcast regarding grief and processes of grief and what we can do to help ourselves through the grief process. Now, first of all, I wanted to show you a graphic here. Obviously, I'm going to also attach it to this blog entry because you can't really see exactly what the words say, but what I'm trying to show you is not the words but the graphic itself. So when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote her groundbreaking work on grief called Death and Dying, she later said, trying to be descriptive about grief. And her words after the reaction to her book were that people turned it into, rather than a description, a prescription, a prescription for how you had to go through grief. Everyone had to go through the 5 stages. Everyone had to, move in some kind of orderly fashion. So this is that graphic in terms of the stages of grief as a prescription. This is experience. This is the description of real grief. This is how it goes. This is what it looks like, because we're most of the time all over the place. We're up 1 hour, down the next. We think we're fine. We're 2 hours later, we're back in the throes of grief that's been triggered by walking by a dog park. Any number of things can trigger the grief in terms of going back and forth in those stages and running up and down the stage process, if you will. One of the things that I stress with the clients that I work with is there is a thing called disenfranchised grief, a concept called disenfranchised grief. Long word, never heard of it myself until I found it. A psychiatrist named Dr. Kenneth Vidoka, back in the 1980s, wrote a groundbreaking book on disenfranchised grief. Part of that book was on disenfranchised grief as it pertained to pet owners, to animal caregivers. What Dr. Doka theorized in disenfranchised grief is that there are societal rules for grieving, most likely unwritten, cultural, religious, maybe having to do with a particular country, but each society has its own rules for grieving. And he believed that there were particular parts of that disenfranchised grief, particular questions that had to be answered correctly for the grief not to be disenfranchised. Now, the word disenfranchised means to have it taken away. 1950s and 60s, they talked about disenfranchised voters, black voters, women voters early on before Voters Acts were passed, were disenfranchised voters. Their right to vote was taken away. Dr. Doka took that term and talked about disenfranchised grief in the sense that the grief of those who have disenfranchised grief, that right, that ability is taken away by society. Dr. Doka says that the questions that society poses to someone in order to disenfranchise grief are primarily these 3, or the prescription, the rules that have to be met have to do with, number 1, who you're grieving for, number 2, how deep the grief is, and number 3, how long the grief is. So in other words, according to societal rules, grief over the loss of a child is, in most societies, the primary worst source of grief. And that is usually, that's kind of across societal cultural rules. So that is a societal rule that says it's okay to grieve for a child. We even, kind of treat people as if something is psychologically wrong with them if they don't grieve for a child. So a family member, husband, wife, mother, father, brother, sister, all of those are acceptable grief relationships, grandmother, grandfather, where you start to have that question raised and where you start to begin the process of having your grief pulled away from you, disenfranchised. When you get to pet ownership, when you lose a dog, where you lose a cat, there are obviously other situations, the death of an ex-husband or an ex-wife. It begins to look to society as if this is not an acceptable form of grief. All of us, if we're pet owners, have lost a pet, have run into I call them the just a dog people or the just a cat people. That is disenfranchised grief in black and white terms. If you lose a dog and you're grieving, how many people have ever said to you, why are you grieving? It's just a dog. And sometimes the smaller the pet is, the more, if we start grieving over a goldfish, how many people are going to look at us for that? It's not what we with disenfranchised grief have to understand and have to let people know is it may not be a societally accepted grief, but it is our grief and is acceptable to us, and we need support through it. Disenfranchised grief comes along in terms of the relationship to the one who has died. Second is the depth of our grief. Once again, for a pet, we get it's just a cat, it's just a dog. Not only is that questioning the relationship, it's questioning how deep our grief is. Somehow, if we have a deep, abiding, strong grief, society says, that's too strong. Your grief for this animal is too strong. It's not acceptable to society. You're having the kind of grief you should save for a family member, as if a pet is not a family member. For a family member, a human family member, mother, daughter, here we go again with the human listing. Animal lovers, animal owners, caregivers who run into this kind of disenfranchised grief know that this is an important relationship that they have lost. And they know that they've heard far too many times that their grief is overboard, that their grief is above and beyond what it should be for an animal. And that is disenfranchising, taking away your ability to grieve or to mourn. The last step that Dr. Doka looks at, the last question is, the last societal rule is, how long should you mourn? Here again, animal caregivers, animal lovers, pet owners run into this. Aren't you over this by now? It's been a month, it's been 2 weeks, it's been whatever length of time the person, the friend, the human family member says, you've been at this too long. It's time to get over it. Just get over it. It's a dog. Get over it. Here again, this person is taking away, disenfranchising your grief, disenfranchising your mourning. What Doka also said is that the more you run into folks who will disenfranchise that grief, the harder it is to heal from that grief. Part of the reason why I do so much work with folks with the pet loss support group and the individual grief counseling is that there is little to almost no support out there for pet owners, animal caregivers who have this grief. We run into societal rules. We run into disenfranchising people or situations, and to find someone who can understand that grief, who validates it, who says, this grief is right, the relationship was big, it's not too deep, you haven't been grieving too long, that's very, very important to animal lovers and to caregivers. Thanks very much for listening to me today. I hope to be able to come back again with another podcast. Thanks so much. I'm Renee.